Four young students, asleep in a small college house, one quiet night in November, and a man who studied crime so deeply, he may have become part of one. Bryan Kohberger was a criminology PhD student trained to understand the mind of a killer. But what happens when the person studying the darkness steps into it? This is the story of how intelligence, obsession, and control collided on the edge of two campuses, and how the clues he thought would hide him became the evidence that exposed him. He wasn't famous, or flashy, or loud. He was simply there in classrooms, in hallways, in quiet moments that most people forget. His name was Bryan Christopher Kohberger, a graduate student who believed he understood how the criminal mind worked. He studied patterns of violence, offender decision-making, and what separates those who only imagine terrible things from those who act on them. By late 2022, Bryan was a PhD student in criminology at Washington State University. He taught undergraduates about police procedure, wrote long essays about criminal intent, and carried himself with the intensity of someone who always wanted to be the smartest person in the room. To some, he was brilliant. To others, uncomfortable, a man who asked questions that felt too personal, too cold. He was the kind of student who stared a little too long, who analyzed instead of conversed. When classmates discussed empathy or victim impact, he steered the topic back to control, dominance, and opportunity. He didn't speak about morality. He spoke about method. Those who knew him in Pennsylvania remembered a different version. A shy teenager, often overweight and isolated. He'd struggled with addiction in his late teens, fought to regain control of his life, and eventually turned to self-discipline as salvation. He lost weight, discovered structure, and developed a fascination with self-control, how to master impulses, how to command the body and the mind. That fixation became his identity. He carried notebooks everywhere, filled with phrases about perception, emotion, and criminal choice. He wrote that people act because they feel powerless, and he wanted to understand why. When he arrived in Washington State, he looked like a man who had rebuilt himself, lean, deliberate, always observing. He spoke softly but precisely, correcting others with facts and research citations. His professors described him as meticulous. His peers described him as distant. Outside of class, Bryan lived alone in a small apartment near campus. The space was almost empty, a single bed, a plain desk, a laptop placed squarely at its center. No posters, no decorations, nothing that hinted at personality. Neighbors noticed the silence. They'd hear him walking at night, pacing above them, sometimes taking out trash long after midnight. He often wore gloves, even in mild weather. They thought it was odd, but not alarming. This was Pullman, a safe college town. He rarely socialized. He didn't drink, didn't attend parties, and kept to strict routines. He went to the gym alone. He ate alone. He studied alone. His isolation wasn't sadness. It was control. Control was his comfort zone. Among students, he sometimes talked about how criminals think. He said things like, "People don't kill without reason. They kill because they can justify it to themselves." At the time, it sounded like theory. In hindsight, it sounded like confession. In one online research survey, later uncovered by investigators, Bryan posted a series of unsettling questions. He wanted convicted criminals to describe their emotions before, during, and after a crime. Questions like, how did you choose your victim? What thoughts ran through your mind as you prepared? What did you feel right after? To colleagues, it was just another graduate study. To the world later, it read like a rehearsal. He often spoke about visualizing the act, understanding not only motive, but process. He believed the perfect crime was the one that left no emotional trace, no human footprint. He admired logic, not empathy. And yet, in every conversation, there was something strangely hollow, as if he could describe feelings, but not experience them. One classmate recalled him saying, "I don't believe in evil, only behavior." Another remembered the long pauses before he answered simple questions, as if translating thoughts from a place ordinary people couldn't reach. Still, no one feared him. He was just Bryan, the quiet guy in the corner who loved data more than people. He graded papers, gave lectures, and held office hours like anyone else. He smiled politely, and no one looked closer. What his professors didn't see was the tension behind that politeness, the mind that constantly measured cause and effect. The student who wanted not just to study crime, but to prove something through it. In his private notes, later seized by investigators, there were entries about separation between thought and action, and what it means to cross the line. He seemed obsessed with the moment when planning becomes reality, when curiosity becomes decision. Forensic limitations and data mapping. He knew how law enforcement tracks suspects through phones, cameras, and DNA. He wrote essays on how offenders adapt to technology. He knew what mistakes investigators look for. He knew what evidence to avoid. That knowledge would soon define him not as a scholar, but as a suspect. In Pullman, people barely knew his name, but across the border in Moscow, Idaho, 4 young students would soon become victims in a case that would make his name known around the world. The man who studied how killers think was about to test his own theory. It began like any other Saturday night in a college town. Music drifted from houses. Students laughed under streetlights, walking home from bars and campus parties. It was a night filled with youth and noise, and everything that feels safe before something unthinkable happens. The small town of Moscow, Idaho, a community of fewer than 25,000 people, was known for peace. Here, people left porch lights on and doors unlocked. It was the kind of place parents trusted. Until that night. Inside a 3-story rental house on King Road, 6 college friends lived together. They were ordinary students, roommates, sharing rent, friendship, and plans for the future. Their home sat on a quiet hillside overlooking the campus. That night, 4 of them would never wake up. The victims were Kaylee Goncalves, Madison Mogan, Xana Kernodle, and Ethan Chapin. All young, bright, and full of energy. Kaylee and Madison were best friends since childhood, inseparable, known for their laughter that filled any room. Xana was strong and independent, with a kind heart that everyone admired. Ethan was the gentle one, a fraternity member who treated people with kindness. They had no enemies, no reason for fear. As the clock moved past 2 in the morning, most of the town slept. Kaylee and Madison returned home from a downtown food truck stop, laughing on camera as they waited for their order. Xana and Ethan came back a little later from a fraternity party. 2 roommates on the lower floor had already gone to bed. The lights went out. The night grew still. Sometime between 4 and 4:30 a.m., a killer entered the house. He carried a K-bar-style military knife, sharp enough to cut silently. He moved through the rooms like a shadow. The Leaf later said there were no signs of forced entry. No broken locks, no shattered windows. Whoever came inside either knew the layout or was prepared to navigate it in the dark. One by one, he attacked. Each strike was deliberate, fast, and precise. There was no shouting, loud enough for neighbors to hear. Only muffled sounds that two surviving roommates later described as confusing. Noises they couldn't identify in their half-sleep. When the house finally fell silent again, 4 young lives were gone. Almost 8 hours later, a 911 call was placed. The dispatcher noted panic and confusion, someone reporting an unconscious person. When officers arrived, they found a scene that stunned even the most seasoned investigators. The brutality, the precision, the sheer silence of it all suggested something more than impulse. It looked calculated. The killer had left almost nothing behind. No footprints on the floors, no visible fingerprints, just the stillness of a house that had turned from laughter to horror in a single hour. News of the murders spread through campus before police even finished taping off the area. By afternoon, students were packing bags, calling parents, and driving out of town. The University of Idaho closed for the week. Reporters arrived by the dozens. Satellite trucks lined the narrow street, and the phrase, "Idaho College Murders," began to appear on national television. Police said little. They warned the community to remain cautious, but gave no names, no suspects, no motive. For a month, the case was a mystery that consumed the nation. Online forums erupted with theories. Strangers speculated about boyfriends, roommates, even random intruders. People analyzed surveillance videos, frame by frame, desperate to identify a face. But behind the scenes, detectives were already following a faint digital trail. Security cameras around Moscow captured a single white Hyundai Elantra driving repeatedly near the crime scene between 3:30 and 4:04 a.m. It circled the neighborhood 4 times, headlights off, before disappearing. To most, it was meaningless. To investigators, it was a lead. Over the next weeks, analysts tracked every similar vehicle in the region. Across the border in Pullman, Washington, police found one registered to a 28-year-old graduate student studying criminology at Washington State University, Bryan Kohberger. The same man who spent his days discussing how criminals plan and how police catch them. At the time, no one outside law enforcement knew his name. Detectives built their case quietly, collecting digital breadcrumbs that mapped his movements before and after the murders. His phone had pinged near the victim's house multiple times in the weeks leading up to the killings. 12 separate visits recorded by nearby cell towers. On the night of the crime, the signal went dark between 2:47 and 4:48 a.m. When it came back online, the device was miles away. That blackout would later become one of the most telling clues of all. They also discovered a small but crucial mistake. Near one of the victims, police recovered a knife sheath stamped with the U.S. Marine Corps insignia. On the metal snap was a single male DNA sample. At first, it matched no one in criminal databases. So, the FBI turned to genealogical tracing, building a family tree from distant relatives who had uploaded DNA profiles online. The search pointed to a single surname, Kohberger. Investigators followed him across the country during the winter break. Bryan had left Washington and driven over 2,000 miles to his parents' home in Pennsylvania. Agents collected trash from outside the house, testing it for DNA. When the lab results came back, the profile matched the father's sample, aligned perfectly with the crime scene DNA on the knife sheath. The probability of coincidence was microscopic. In the early hours of December 30th, 2022, armed teens surrounded the Kohberger residence. Inside, Bryan was awake. He was wearing gloves, his car parked outside, packed for a long drive. He surrendered quietly. No resistance, no questions, just silence. Neighbors later said they heard shouting when police entered, but Bryan remained calm. His parents were stunned. His father asked, "What's going on?" Officers replied, "Your son is under arrest for murder." At that moment, the search for a faceless killer ended, and a new mystery began. How could a criminology student, someone trained to study murder, be accused of committing one? Back in Moscow, students returned to campus under heavy security. Memorials filled the lawn outside the university. Candles, flowers, handwritten notes with 4 names: Kaylee, Madison, Xana, Ethan. Their photographs glowed in the candlelight, while television crews broadcast live from the same street where laughter once echoed. Across the state line, detectives combed through Kohberger's apartment. They found black gloves, cleaning agents, and a pillowcase with possible blood traces. They found the same white Hyundai Elantra that circled King Road on the night of the murders. And they found his computer, still on the desk, filled with academic papers about forensic psychology and offender profiling. The story had come full circle. A man who studied how police catch killers had been caught by the very methods he analyzed. Forensic precision, DNA, technology. For the families, none of that mattered. Their children were gone, and no explanation would ever be enough. But for investigators, the quiet graduate student now had a new title: Suspect Number 1. The night of horror had ended. The long search for truth was only beginning. The moment Bryan Kohberger was arrested, investigators knew their work was only beginning. They had a suspect, but now they needed a story that evidence could tell beyond any doubt. Every detail mattered, every second of data, every trace left behind by a man who believed he was smarter than the system studying him. At first glance, Bryan looked like the kind of person who should have been impossible to catch. He knew forensic procedure. He knew how investigators trace phone activity and vehicle movement. He lectured on criminology. He wrote essays about digital footprints and offender profiling. He knew the rules. But like every criminal who believes he can outthink the world, he forgot one truth: there's no such thing as perfect planning. The digital web. The first thread was digital. Detectives pulled weeks of data from nearby cell towers and Wi-Fi routers around the King Road neighborhood. Among thousands of signals, one phone appeared again and again: Bryan's. From June to November 2022, his phone had pinged near the victim's house 12 separate times. Sometimes late at night, sometimes early in the morning. It was never random. It looked like surveillance, careful, repetitive, patterned. On the night of the murders, his phone went dark at 2:47 a.m. No calls, no messages, no signal of any kind. It stayed silent for exactly 2 hours, reactivating at 4:48 a.m., more than 10 miles away. That blackout perfectly matched the window of the killings. When investigators mapped the route, it traced a quiet back road connecting Washington State University to Moscow, Idaho. The digital trail was growing stronger, but they needed physical proof. The car. Next came the car. That white Hyundai Elantra, seen circling the area, became the second pillar of evidence. Video footage placed the car on 8 separate cameras around the crime scene. It appeared at 3:29 a.m., headlights off, and again at 4:04 a.m., weaving the neighborhood at high speed. A traffic camera later caught the same vehicle passing through Pullman, heading toward Kohberger's apartment complex at 5:25 a.m. When police searched his car after the arrest, they found a small stain on the seatbelt buckle. Tests later confirmed the presence of human blood. Fibers inside the vehicle matched those from the victim's bedding. Even the tire treads matched impressions found in the dirt outside the house. To prosecutors, the car was the silent witness that never lied. It followed him, recorded him, and ultimately betrayed him, the DNA. But the strongest link, the one that turned suspicion into certainty, was the DNA. At the crime scene, near Madison Mogen's bed, lay a knife sheath. It was tan leather, military grade, stamped with the U.S. Marine Corps insignia. Inside the button clasp, technicians found a single male DNA sample. At first, it matched no one in state or national databases. But forensic genealogy, a technique once used to catch the Golden State Killer, opened a new path. By comparing that DNA to public genealogy databases, analysts found distant relatives of the suspect. The pattern traced back to a family in Pennsylvania, the Kohbergers. FBI agents collected trash from outside the Kohberger family home, testing it against the crime scene sample. The results were conclusive. The DNA from the knife sheath belonged to the biological son of the man whose trash they collected. That son was Bryan Kohberger. The odds of a random match were 1 in 100 trillion. The apartment search. Inside Bryan's apartment, investigators discovered a chilling level of cleanliness. No carpet fibers out of place. No fingerprints on surfaces. The mattress was stripped. The garbage bin was empty. It looked like someone preparing for inspection. Still, the smallest details gave him away. On a pillowcase, lab tests found microscopic blood traces. In the kitchen drawer, a single hair believed to belong to one of the victims. He had tried to erase everything, but the body remembers what the mind forgets. DNA always remains. They also found his laptop, containing notes about visual tracking, stalking behavior, and risk calculation. Search histories included queries about body decomposition and knife blade strength. Even for a criminology student, the pattern was too specific, too intentional. Behavioral patterns. Behavioral experts from the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit reviewed the evidence and found that Bryan's movements matched what they call pre-offense behavior. The pattern of surveillance and fantasy that precedes violent crime visited the area multiple times before the murders, likely observing daily routines. He turned off his phone to conceal proximity. He cleaned obsessively after the act, and afterward, he returned to normal life with chilling composure. In the days following the killings, classmates remembered him leading discussions about criminal psychology with calm precision. One student recalled him saying, "Sometimes killers make mistakes they can't see in the moment." Another said he looked unusually alert, as if energized. For investigators, that calmness was another piece of evidence, not emotional proof, but behavioral proof. It was the profile of a man who needed control at all costs. The cross-country drive, when winter break began. Bryan and his father drove from Washington to Pennsylvania, more than 2,000 miles across the United States. Police, in coordination with the FBI, tracked the entire journey. Along the route, highway cameras captured their car several times. In one body cam video from Indiana, Bryan sits in the passenger seat as his father explains they are coming from Washington State University. The officer asks where they're headed. Bryan answers softly, Pennsylvania. He doesn't blink. He doesn't fidget. He just stares ahead. It's the look of someone rehearsing calm. A man who has memorized what guilt should never look like. The final mosaic. By January 2023, investigators had assembled the full mosaic. Each layer, phone data, car movement, video surveillance, DNA, and psychological profile, overlapped perfectly. The result was not a coincidence. It was a timeline. From early summer surveillance, to the moment his phone went dark, to the drive home across the country, everything aligned. Every scientific test, every digital record, every behavioral clue pointed to one person. Prosecutors. The pattern was clear. Bryan Kohberger had used his education in criminology not to prevent crime, but to perform it. He studied methods of detection so he could hide better. He studied criminal psychology so he could control fear. And in doing so, he proved what his professors had always warned about. Knowledge without empathy becomes a weapon. The return to silence. In interviews after his arrest, Bryan showed no remorse. He maintained his innocence, speaking only through lawyers. When asked if he understood the charges against him, he said calmly, "Yes." No emotion, no questions, just that one word. Inside his cell, he began to live the life he once studied: isolation, routine, and observation. He no longer analyzed killers. He became one of the case studies he once admired. And for investigators, the evidence told the story in full. The car, the phone, the DNA, the silence. Each element proving that the man who wanted to understand criminal behavior had left behind a trail of his own. The man who once studied how killers think was about to experience what it feels like to be hunted. By late December 2022, the investigation into the Idaho murders had reached a quiet certainty. Detectives knew who they were looking for, and they knew where he was. Bryan Kohberger had become the shadow they followed across the map. He had watched victims before. Now, the watchers were him. For weeks, a team of FBI agents, state troopers, and local police worked in silence, tracking every mile he drove across America. From Washington State to Pennsylvania, they watched the same white Hyundai glide along interstate highways, sometimes stopping for gas, sometimes parked overnight in motel lots. They never intervened. They wanted to see what he would do. He didn't seem nervous. He didn't change his route. He drove with precision, cruise control steady. Mirrors checked often. When his car passed through Indiana, officers conducted 2 separate traffic stops within minutes of each other. Both were legal. Both were strategic. Each encounter was filmed by body camera. In the footage, Bryan sits beside his father, calm and polite. When asked where they're headed, he says softly, "Pennsylvania." The officer lets them go. Behind the scenes, the FBI watched in real time, confirming his location. The calmness was deceptive, almost theatrical. He looked like a man trying to appear ordinary. But by then, there was nothing ordinary about him. The early morning arrest. On December 30th, 2022, at 1:30 a.m., a tactical team surrounded the Kohberger family home in Albrightsville, Pennsylvania. The quiet street, filled with headlights and the faint hum of engines. Neighbors awoke to the sound of commands shouted through loudspeakers. "Bryan Kohberger, come out with your hands up." Inside, Bryan was awake. He had been pacing for hours, according to investigators. When police entered, he stood near the kitchen, dressed in black, wearing gloves. He didn't resist. He didn't ask why. He simply said, "What's going on?" Moments later, he was handcuffed and led outside into the cold December air. His father and mother watched in disbelief. He said nothing to them. In the car that took him away, Bryan remained silent, no questions, no protests, only stillness, as if he already knew that words no longer mattered. The evidence within reach. Inside the house, officers found multiple knives, a Glock pistol, and several black gloves. They collected his clothing, the sheets from his bed, and a computer. In the trash, they found medical-style gloves and packaging consistent with cleaning supplies. Every piece of the quiet student's world became part of the investigation. When forensic teams examined the car, they found traces of DNA consistent with the crime scene. And in pause, on the driver's seatbelt buckle was a faint spot of blood. On the gas pedal, another trace. Even the vacuum cleaner in his trunk contained fibers later linked to the victim's bedding. He had studied how criminals clean, how they conceal evidence, how they move under pressure. But he had underestimated how small a world technology had made. Every step, every object, every breath left a trace. The transfer. After his arrest, Bryan appeared briefly in a Pennsylvania courtroom. He waived his right to fight extradition and agreed to return to Idaho. As he stood before the judge, cameras captured his first public appearance. The face that had once sat silently in classrooms was now seen around the world. Sharp features, blank eyes, and a calm that felt almost rehearsed. When asked if he understood the charges against him, he replied, "Yes." Just one word. No emotion. No expression. That moment became the defining image of his trial. Not fear. Not defiance. Just emptiness. He was flown under heavy security back to Idaho, escorted by state police. Reporters gathered at the courthouse when the convoy arrived. Cameras clicked as he stepped out in shackles, wearing a bulletproof vest. For many watching, it was still hard to believe. The man accused of killing 4 college students was a criminology PhD candidate. Bryan Kohberger was obsessed with power and perception. He studied control not as an idea, but as a way of living. His academic focus on criminal psychology may have given him a dangerous illusion, the belief that he could think like killers and still remain separate from them. Some experts describe it as narcissistic identification, a phenomenon where fascination becomes imitation. He didn't just study violence, he began to admire the idea of mastery over fear. To him, the perfect crime was not about rage or revenge, it was about intellect, about outsmarting everyone else. In this view, the murders were not crimes of passion, they were crimes of ego. A test, a demonstration. Others believe it was deeper, that isolation had hollowed him. Years of studying behavior from the outside had disconnected him from emotion. He could describe empathy in theory, but not feel it in practice. He understood the rules of morality, but not the meaning of it. He wanted to be someone extraordinary in a world where he felt invisible. And that desire turned dark. The behavior after the murders. After the killings, Bryan didn't hide. He returned to campus, graded assignments, and attended classes as if nothing happened. He spoke to colleagues about final projects and volunteered in discussions about crime scene analysis. One student recalled that he appeared more confident than ever, as if something had lifted a weight off him. Perhaps he believed he had succeeded. He drove the same car, used the same phone, lived the same quiet life. But beneath that routine, the digital and forensic world was already closing in. By the time the police came for him, he was the last person in the investigation who still believed he was free. No visible reaction to the evidence against him. He reads legal documents, studies the charges, and speaks to his lawyers in calm tones. To observers, he appears detached. The same quiet student, still analyzing, still measuring. But outside those walls, the world sees him differently now. He's not a researcher or a teacher. He's the man accused of shattering 4 families and changing a college town forever. Psychologists say his behavior after arrest mirrors that of other calculated offenders. Control is his language. Silence is his weapon. Every unspoken word, every blank stare, is an attempt to remain the one with power. But power has shifted. He is no longer the observer. He is the observed. And for the first time, the student of crime has become the lesson itself. The question that remains. Even now, the motive remains partly hidden, trapped somewhere between arrogance and emptiness. Did he want recognition? Did he want to test the system? Or did he simply want to know what it felt like to take control in the most absolute way? Whatever the reason, one truth is clear. Bryan Kohberger wasn't just chasing knowledge. He was chasing control. And when his mind could no longer separate study from desire, the line between theory and reality disappeared. That's when the classroom turned into a crime scene, and the observer became the monster he thought he could only study. The investigation had ended, but the search for justice was only beginning. Bryan Kohberger's arrest had given the community a name, yet a name was not enough. Families needed answers, a college town needed closure, and a courtroom would now decide the truth. When Bryan arrived in Idaho County Jail, the cameras were waiting. He was escorted through narrow corridors in shackles, his eyes fixed straight ahead. No emotion. No reaction to the reporters calling his name. To the public, it was the first close look at the man accused of ending 4 promising lives. The first hearing. In early 2023, he appeared in an Idaho courtroom for his initial hearing. The setting was small, quiet wood panels, low lighting, the hum of cameras outside. He wore an orange jumpsuit and bullet-resistant vest. His face looked pale against the bright courtroom lights. As the judge read the charges, 4 counts of first-degree murder and 1 of felony burglary, he stood motionless. When asked if he understood the accusations, he said softly, "Yes." Nothing more. That single word echoed through the room, carried by the same emptiness that had followed him since the arrest. The prosecution outlined the evidence in measured tones. The DNA on the knife sheath, the phone data, the car footage, and the behavioral profile that tied every thread together. The defense said little, only that Bryan maintained his innocence and looked forward to clearing his name. But the courtroom wasn't just a legal arena. It was an emotional battlefield. In the front rows sat the families of Kaylee, Madison, Xana, and Ethan, parents, siblings, and friends, holding photographs, clutching one another's hands. Their faces carried months of grief, sharpened now into quiet resolve. For them, this was not theory, it was reality. They wanted to hear the truth spoken aloud. The legal strategy. Bryan Kohberger's attorneys built their case around reasonable doubt. They questioned the integrity of the DNA process, the timeline of the phone data, and the possibility of contamination. They claimed investigators had focused too quickly on one suspect. They hinted that the car, the cell records, and the surveillance might all be circumstantial, but prosecutors had a different narrative, one of precision and inevitability. They described a man whose curiosity about violence had evolved into a plan. A man who used education as camouflage, who believed intellect could erase evidence. They called the murders a study in control. Behind the scenes, the court prepared for what would become one of Idaho's most closely watched trials in decades. The media filed daily reports. Online discussions dissected every hearing. True crime audiences around the world waited for the outcome. The prosecution's case. In pretrial filings, the prosecution laid out a chilling picture of how science cornered him. The timeline of his phone activity aligned with vehicle tracking data. The DNA evidence matched his profile to an almost impossible degree of certainty. The fibers in his car, the glove in his trash, the blood trace on his seatbelt, each detail small on its own, but together, forming a pattern that could not be ignored. They argued that Bryan Kohberger acted with deliberate intent, planning, observing, and executing the killings with methodical precision. Their motive theory was not passion, jealousy, or rage. It was power. A need to prove that he could outsmart everyone, including the very system he studied. The defense's response. His lawyers countered with questions about process. Was the DNA handled correctly? Could genealogical matching be flawed? Did police rush to judgment? They painted Bryan as a socially awkward academic, caught in a perfect storm of coincidence and media pressure. They pointed to his quiet demeanor, his cooperative behavior during the arrest, his lack of criminal history. They tried to humanize him, describing a man who spent his life seeking understanding, not destruction. But every argument returned to one problem. The evidence didn't disappear. It was there, microscopic and undeniable. The families and the public. Outside the courthouse, people gathered with signs reading, "Justice for Kaylee," "Justice for Xana," "Justice for Madison and Ethan." Candles burned each night on the courthouse lawn. Inside, the victims' families listened to testimony about phone pings, DNA chains, and knife angles, scientific words that described their children's final moments. Their grief was visible, but dignified. They smiled at each other for strength. They cried silently. During breaks. For them, every fact was a memory reopened, every photograph another reminder of what was lost. The case had become more than evidence. It was a portrait of two worlds colliding, one of innocence and promise, the other of calculation and control. Behavior in court. Observers noted Bryan's posture, always straight, always still. He rarely looked at the families, never reacted to testimony, and occasionally scribbled notes on a yellow pad. His expression stayed neutral, the same as during his teaching days. Some saw arrogance. Others saw detachment. Psychologists watching from afar called it a performance of composure. He wanted to appear logical, unshaken, in control. But control was slipping away. Every document read aloud, every scientific slide projected onto the courtroom screen, was another layer of truth closing in around him. The search for justice. As months passed, hearings turned into milestones, rulings on evidence, witness lists, and DNA testing. Each new disclosure deepened the picture of the crime and the mind behind it. Experts testified on behavioral patterns. Forensic scientists described how even the smallest genetic fragment can lead to identification. Law enforcement officers recounted the surveillance that brought him down. For the families, every session felt like reliving the night of November 13th. For the community, it was a slow awakening from fear to understanding. The trial wasn't only about guilt. It was about truth, the slow, painful kind that rebuilds trust one fact at a time. Awaiting the verdict. As of now, the final verdict remains in process, with multiple pre-trial motions and delays. But the emotional verdict came long ago. In the eyes of those who lost everything, guilt is not measured by legal language. It's measured by absence, by empty bedrooms, by birthdays that will never be celebrated again. No sentence can bring them back. No ruling can erase the horror. But every time the courtroom opens its doors, every time their names are spoken aloud, the truth takes one more step out of the darkness. And in that, justice begins. When a story like this breaks, it doesn't just shock people, it fascinates them. A criminology student accused of mass murder, it feels impossible, yet real. The question shifts from what happened to how could someone like him do this? To understand Bryan Kohberger, psychologists began studying every detail of his life, not just his actions, but his patterns, his behavior, his silence, his need for control. The psychological blueprint. Forensic psychologists describe Bryan as a man who fits a rare and disturbing profile, the narcissistic academic offender. This is someone who seeks validation through intellect, who values being seen as brilliant more than being good. Control is their form of comfort. Superiority is their source of identity. Bryan's fascination with criminology wasn't casual, it was immersive, a lifelong attempt to decode the human mind from a distance. But as one professor later said, he studied emotion like an outsider looking through glass. He could analyze empathy, but he couldn't feel it. He spoke about fear without understanding what it means to have any. In his academic work, he often focused on patterns, how offenders plan, what motivates them, how they avoid capture. He wrote essays about criminal decision-making models and behavioral sequencing. To him, crime wasn't moral or immoral. It was procedural. It was math. Over time, experts believe that curiosity turned inward. He stopped observing from the outside and began imagining from the inside. He started asking not just how killers think, but how it feels to be one. Control and isolation. People who knew Bryan describe a man who craved control in every detail of his life. His diet, his sleep schedule, his conversations, even his posture. He once told a classmate, "When you control your environment, nothing surprises you." But that obsession with control isolated him. He built walls between himself and the world. He spoke to others like a researcher collecting data, not a friend seeking connection. And when people failed to meet his expectations, he withdrew completely. Psychologists call this pattern cognitive disconnection, the gradual separation between intellect and emotion. It's what happens when someone knows how to describe feelings, but doesn't know how to experience them. Over time, that void can become dangerous. Because when empathy fades, curiosity loses boundaries. The illusion of superiority. Many experts believe that Bryan saw himself as intellectually superior. He studied how law enforcement works and likely viewed most people as predictable, easy to read, easy to manipulate. His calmness after the murders, his confidence during questioning, his polite tone in court, all consistent with someone who believes he's in control, even when he isn't. One psychologist described his behavior as performative detachment. It's not real calmness. It's a mask, a way of telling himself he still has power. Because for people like him, losing control is worse than being caught. Mirroring the killers he studied. What makes Bryan's case haunting is how closely his actions mirror the criminals he once analyzed. The surveillance, the planning, the concealment, these are not impulsive acts. They're steps in a psychological experiment, one he conducted on himself. He wanted to understand what it feels like to cross the line between thought and action. He wanted to know what complete control actually meant. And once he crossed that line, there was no going back. This is what psychologists call identification through obsession. The more he studied violent minds, the more he saw pieces of himself reflected back. Eventually, the mirror became a doorway. The media reaction. When news broke of his arrest, the media world exploded. Headlines read, "Criminology student arrested for Idaho murders." He studied killers, then became one. True crime podcasts, documentaries, and news segments flooded the internet. Everyone wanted to understand how the student of justice became the face of evil. But with every article, every video, a new debate began. Had society turned crime into entertainment? Was the public's obsession with killers feeding the very narcissism that creates them? Social media only amplified the fascination. People compared him to other infamous offenders, analyzing his walk, his stare, his handwriting. Some even wrote to him in jail, offering sympathy or curiosity. It was the same disturbing pattern seen in countless other high-profile cases, where fear turns into fascination. The dual role of true crime. Psychologists argue that true crime stories serve two purposes. They warn us and they mirror us. They reveal what we fear most and what we secretly want to understand, the boundaries of human darkness. In Bryan's case, the story felt personal to millions of people. He wasn't a stereotypical monster. He looked normal. He sounded intelligent. He lived among ordinary students, and that made it more frightening. Because if someone like him could do something like this, what does that say about how thin the line really is between curiosity and destruction? Public grief and healing. As the months passed, the media storm began to quiet. Attention shifted from the suspect to the victims, to who they were and what they meant to those who loved them. Memorial scholarships were created in their names. Students held candlelight vigils every year on the anniversary of the murders. Families spoke about turning tragedy into awareness, teaching others to notice early signs of isolation, obsession, and emotional decline. Communities came together, determined that their children would not be remembered only for how they died, but for how they lived. A mirror for society. The story of Bryan Kohberger forces us to look inward. It isn't just about one man's descent into darkness. It's about how society creates space for that descent, how obsession with control, image, and intellect can evolve into something inhuman. He is the product of a culture that glorifies brilliance, rewards detachment, and studies evil from a safe distance. But evil doesn't stay on the page. It seeps through. And when curiosity loses compassion, knowledge becomes a weapon. In the end, Bryan Kohberger may be just one name among many in the history of crime, but his story serves as a reflection, a warning that intelligence without Empathy is a dangerous thing. That obsession without humanity eventually turns inward. Reflection. As the world watches his trial unfold, one truth remains. Bryan Kohberger wanted to understand killers. He wanted to know what they felt, what they feared, and what made them act. Now, he doesn't have to study them anymore. He has become one of them. And in the quiet hours of his cell, when there's nothing left to analyze, he's finally living the question he spent his life asking. When the noise fades and the cameras move on, what remains are questions that never leave. Why do people like Bryan Kohberger exist? How does a mind that studies evil become it? And what does that say about us, the ones who watch, listen, and search for answers? For months, his story has echoed through courtrooms, newsrooms, and college halls. It's a story that feels both terrifying and familiar because it doesn't belong only to him. It belongs to a culture that's endlessly curious about darkness and endlessly shocked when darkness looks like us. The man behind the silence. Inside his cell, Bryan Kohberger lives the life he once studied. A daily routine, repetition, silence. Breakfast at dawn, interrogations replaced by paperwork. And the same question written into every day that passes: why? He doesn't speak to the public. He doesn't show emotion. He studies, he reads, he writes notes, as if still preparing for a test that already ended. But there's nothing left to prove. The evidence speaks louder than he ever could. The criminology student who thought he understood killers now understands what it feels like to be one. Isolated, observed, and analyzed by others. In the end, that may be his final punishment. Not the walls, not the sentence, but the mirror he can't escape. The victims remembered. For the families of Kaylee Goncalves, Madison Mogan, Xana Kernodle, and Ethan Chapin, justice will never mean peace. Their children's names have become symbols, reminders of how quickly innocence can vanish in the hands of one person's obsession. Kaylee and Madison, lifelong friends, always together, smiling in every photo. Xana and Ethan, young love, kind hearts, full of promise. They should have graduated, started careers, built futures. Instead, their memories now live in scholarships, in vigils, in quiet moments when the world pauses to remember. Every candle lit for them is a refusal to let the story end with fear. It's a reminder that even in tragedy, there is resilience, and that light will always return to the places darkness tried to take. The lesson beneath the story. True crime often asks how. How someone planned, how someone killed, how they were caught. But stories like this ask something deeper. Why do we keep looking? Maybe because every time we face the darkness, we hope to recognize it before it gets too close. Maybe because understanding it makes us feel safer. Or maybe because we see pieces of it in our own reflection, ambition, pride, loneliness, control. All the things that make people human until they lose balance. Bryan Kohberger didn't kill out of impulse. He killed out of emptiness, the kind that intelligence can't fill and success can't hide. He mistook knowledge for meaning. And in trying to prove he understood power, he destroyed everything real in his reach. That is the dark truth at the center of this story. Not that he studied crime, but that he never studied himself. The broader reflection. In a world where information is everywhere and empathy is fading, cases like this remind us that brilliance without compassion is dangerous. That studying evil is not the same as resisting it. That control is not the same as strength. Bryan Kohberger believed he was the observer, but in the end, he was the example. This story is now a warning to every mind that confuses curiosity with dominance, and every heart that forgets the weight of human life. Evil doesn't always scream. Sometimes it studies quietly, takes notes, and waits for a moment to test its theory. Final reflection. The Idaho murders shook a nation, but they also forced us to remember what truly matters: compassion, awareness, and the courage to look beyond appearances. 4 innocent lives remind us that the greatest strength isn't in intellect or control. It's in empathy, the one thing Bryan Kohberger never learned. Because when empathy disappears, what's left isn't intelligence. It's calculation without conscience. And when that happens, even the brightest minds can fall into darkness. This story will fade from the headlines one day, but its message will remain. Knowledge can explain how evil happens. Only humanity can stop it. If this story made you stop and think, make sure to subscribe to Dark Truths, True Crime Stories. Every week, we uncover the hidden psychology behind real crime stories that remind us how thin the line is between good and evil. Like this video if you believe truth deserves to be told. Comment your thoughts below. What do you think drives people like Bryan Kohberger? Is it control, emptiness, or something deeper? And share this documentary to help others see the warning signs that often go unnoticed. Your support helps this channel grow, reach more people, and keep telling the stories that matter. Because understanding darkness is the only way to protect the light.